You've seen the marble statues. You've heard the epic tales of gladiators, emperors, and endless feasts. Rome's golden age, a time of unmatched power and prosperity. But what if I told you that most Romans didn't live anything close to that dream? Behind the polished stone and political glory was a dirtier, darker reality. And the truth is, you probably wouldn't have lasted a week in the real ancient Rome. Because while history likes to paint Rome's golden age as a paradise of progress, the streets told a different story, one filled with overflowing sewage, class divisions, riots, and a daily struggle to survive. So what was it really like to live in the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? Let's step back in time and unmask the truth, the daily life in the Golden Age. Let's start with the streets, not the polished marble halls of the Senate, the real streets where most Romans lived. They were loud, chaotic, and absolutely filthy. Trash piled up in alleys. Human waste was tossed into the streets from upper-floor windows, and stepping in something foul was just part of the morning routine. The smell? A mix of sweat, rotting food, and sewage. The city was noisy 24/7. Street vendors shouted about olives and oil, children played barefoot in the mud, and carts rumbled across uneven stones. Rome was alive, yes, but it wasn't clean, quiet, or glamorous. While the elite lived in marble villas with gardens and mosaics, most citizens crammed into insulae, multi-story apartment blocks made of wood and brick. These buildings were cheaply built and dangerously unstable. Fires broke out frequently, and structural collapses were common. If you lived on the upper floors, you didn't just risk falling through the floor, you had to haul your own water upstairs every day. And those romanticized Roman baths? Yes, they were social hubs, but they were also breeding grounds for disease. Hundreds of people sharing warm, unfiltered water, rubbing themselves down with communal oil scrapers called strigils. Doctors warned about infections, but people came anyway. It was either that or stay dirty. Now let's talk food. Most Romans lived on a diet of bread, porridge, pulse, lentils, olives, and the infamous garum, a fermented fish sauce used to flavor almost everything. Think soy sauce meets rotten anchovies, and it was everywhere. Wine was consumed daily, often watered down, and often by children. Fresh meat, reserved for the wealthy or for feast days. Poor Romans might eat spoiled meat masked with spices or vinegar. Hunger was common. Malnutrition was normal. Life expectancy in Rome's golden age? If you made it to 30, you were doing well. Work, wealth, and class divide. Rome was built on power, and power meant class. Your tunic, your sandals, even the way you wore your hair sent signals about your social status. At the top were the senators and equestrians, political elites and wealthy landowners who controlled legislation and commanded armies. They threw lavish banquets with imported delicacies, oysters from Britain, dates from Judea, even flamingo tongues and roasted dormice. These men owned country estates, villas with heated floors, and more slaves than they could count. Then came the plebeians, free citizens who worked as craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers. They made up the muscle of Rome, but earned just enough to survive. A single economic downturn, drought, or injury could ruin an entire family. Jobs were competitive. Guilds protected skilled labor, but entry wasn't easy. And for women, there were no careers. Most stayed home, running households, or worked in domestic service if they were poor. Below them were the freedmen, former slaves who had earned or been granted their freedom. They could become successful merchants, even wealthy, but they carried the stigma of their past and could never hold public office. And at the very bottom, the enslaved population. Slaves made up as much as 40% of Rome's population. They were captured in war, born into slavery, or sold by desperate families. Some worked in households or tutored children. Others toiled in the mines, where life expectancy could be measured in months. They had no rights, no protections. They were property. Social mobility was a dream sold to the masses. Yes, a freedman could rise. Yes, a plebeian could strike it rich. But the truth? Most people died in the class they were born into. And still, Romans obsessed over status. They hosted dinner parties to show off their wealth, wore rings to signal political loyalty, and even arranged fake funerals to parade their ancestors' greatness. Reputation was everything. Entertainment and social control. Entertainment in ancient Rome wasn't just about having fun, it was about maintaining control. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, wasn't a joke. It was a tactic. Free grain was distributed to poor citizens through state-sponsored welfare. And while they waited in long lines for food, the Colosseum offered them a front-row seat to bloodshed. Gladiators weren't heroes. They were often enslaved men, criminals, or prisoners of war, trained to kill for sport. The average life expectancy of a gladiator was under 10 matches. They fought animals, other men, even staged naval battles in flooded arenas. Some were celebrities, yes, but most were disposable. Public executions were a spectacle. Imagine crowds cheering as a man was burned alive or devoured by wild animals. Not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, as families watched with snacks in hand. Theater wasn't safe either. Plays had political undertones, and satire could get you executed if it mocked the wrong man. The government used culture to mold opinion, reward loyalty, and distract the restless poor. The elite understood one thing: bored citizens could become angry citizens, so they gave them games, gossip, and gore. The myth of Roman grandeur. Rome's wealth and greatness were real, but they came at a staggering cost. Much of the empire's prosperity came not from invention, but from conquest. Roman legions stormed across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, looting cities, enslaving populations, and funneling riches back to the capital. Taxes weren't just monetary. Conquered people paid in gold, grain, labor, and blood. Those magnificent temples, built with stolen wealth. Those aqueducts, designed to serve the elite first. In poor neighborhoods, broken pipes spilled water into the streets while patricians had fountains in their gardens. Pax Romana, the 200-year peace, was enforced through terror. Any sign of rebellion was crushed. Riots in Judea, mass crucifixions, dissent in Gaul, entire villages wiped out. Rome's so-called civilization was a boot on the neck of its colonies, and even inside the city walls, things weren't stable. Political assassinations were common. Emperors were poisoned, stabbed, or betrayed. 1 in every 4 emperors died violently. Loyalty was always for sale, and betrayal was always just 1 coin away. So yes, the Roman Empire reached astonishing heights, but it also carried astonishing darkness. Behind the art, architecture, and philosophy was a society addicted to power, built on inequality and hiding a rotten core. By now you've seen both sides of the empire, the polished facade and the brutal foundation. But here's the most unsettling truth. The Roman Golden Age wasn't a time of equality, enlightenment, or universal peace. It was an illusion. Gold-plated on the outside, but corroding from within. The very prosperity Rome boasted about was built on borrowed time. The grain that fed the city came from North Africa and Egypt, vulnerable to drought, piracy, or rebellion. The wealth came from conquest, but the more Rome expanded, the more it had to defend. The elite grew richer, but the poor grew more desperate, dependent on handouts and spectacles just to survive another week. And underneath it all was the slave engine. Millions of men, women, and children forced into labor, driving the economy without rights or rest. If slaves resisted, they were crucified along roadsides as a warning to others. Rome didn't just conquer cities, it conquered bodies. Even the emperors were trapped in their own system. Take Nero, who bathed in gold and silenced dissent with executions. Or Domitian, who ruled through paranoia, exiling senators for minor offenses. Some historians estimate that 1 out of every 4 emperors was assassinated. Power in Rome wasn't held, it was survived. This was the Golden Age, a time where peace meant silence, and progress meant oppression for millions. So why should any of this matter to us today, in a world so far removed from togas and temples? Because Rome is more than a chapter in a history book. It's a mirror. It shows us what happens when a society prioritizes image over substance, expansion over sustainability, and elite comfort over collective well-being. Look at any empire, any global power, and you'll see echoes of Rome, the concentration of wealth, the struggle of the working class, the use of distraction, whether it's sports, entertainment, or fear, to keep people from asking hard questions. These patterns didn't die with the Caesars. Rome's fall didn't happen overnight. It unraveled gradually. through moral decay, economic exploitation, and leadership that mistook luxury for strength. The people who lived through its decline didn't even realize they were watching an empire collapse. They just saw rising prices, growing corruption, and a society that no longer worked the way it used to. Sound familiar?